13 machine guns, 4 engines, 2 tons of steel armor. The B-17 was a flying fortress in every sense of the word, but the heavy plating offered a false sense of security. These bombers suffered one of the highest attrition rates of any aircraft in history, 4,750. That is the number of B-17s lost in combat during World War II. The statistics are even more brutal when looking at the human cost. Each plane carried a 10-man crew. Every crash meant 10 lives lost or captured. Simple math reveals the scale of the disaster. 47,000 airmen never returned to their bases. The footage shows the reality of the sky. Flak clouds turn the air black. Wings snap under the pressure of cannon fire. Bombers tumble toward the ground in flames. It was not just a mission, it was a lottery with lethal odds. Why was the casualty rate so high? The military believed the planes were invincible in tight formations. They were wrong. German fighters exploited every gap in the defense. The results were catastrophic. One job stood out as the most dangerous: the ball turret gunner. This soldier sat in a plexiglass bubble hanging beneath the fuselage. He was trapped in a space smaller than a trunk. There was no room for a parachute. If the landing gear jammed, the gunner was crushed against the runway. Events accelerated. As the bombing campaign deepens, the losses mount. Every flight became a walk into a trap. This is the story of how a person's job could turn into a death sentence. It is the history of the most famous aircraft in the world. The sound of wind whistling through bullet holes is constant. Thus began the air war over Europe. 1918. World War I ended, but the nature of combat changed forever. The horrors of the trenches forced every global power to rethink their strategy. Standard infantry charges were now obsolete. Militaries shifted their focus toward advanced technology. Aircraft became the new priority. Strategists looked at the sky. They believed long-range bombers could bypass enemy lines entirely. The idea was simple. Heavy planes would strike deep into the heart of a nation and break its will to fight. By the 1930s, this theory took hold in the United States. The Air Corps needed a total overhaul. Most units still flew outdated planes made of wood and fabric. The military demanded all-metal designs. In 1934, officials issued a formal request for a new long-range bomber. The specifications were strict. The plane had to reach speeds of 250 miles per hour. It needed to climb to 10,000 feet. Most importantly, it had to cover 2,000 miles on a single tank of fuel. There was a catch. The Air Corps refused to pay for development. Companies had to fund their own prototypes. It was a winner-take-all competition. The prize was a contract for 220 aircraft. At that moment, Boeing was on the verge of bankruptcy. Their bank accounts were nearly empty. But the executives took a massive gamble. They poured every cent of their remaining capital into one design. This was the Model 299. It was America's first all-metal bomber with 4 engines. The footage from the test flight shows a massive machine. It didn't just meet the military's requirements, it exceeded them in every category. It was faster, stronger, and flew further than anyone expected. This was the birth of a legend. During a press event, a journalist walked around the aircraft. He counted the gun ports. He saw machine guns pointing from the nose, the tail, and the sides. He described it as a flying fortress. The name stuck instantly. This was no longer just a plane. It was a signal to the world. The Flying Fortress. The name stuck immediately, but the project nearly ended before it began. 1935. The Boeing prototype took off for a demonstration flight and crashed seconds later. 2 pilots died in the wreckage. The fire consumed the fuselage and the massive contract. The military disqualified Boeing on the spot. They chose the Douglas DB-1 instead. The Air Corps ordered 133 Douglas bombers. Boeing was sidelined. The Army bought only 13 YB-17s for basic testing. Boeing engineers did not stop. They modified the engines. They adjusted the wings. They built only 10 of these early models. No one predicted the coming chaos. September 1939 changed everything. Germany invaded Poland. Europe was at war. In the Pacific, tensions with Japan reached a breaking point. Washington watched the maps. They realized the United States lacked long-range teeth. Douglas could not keep up. Their production lines moved too slowly. Their bombers lacked the range and power for a global conflict. By 1940, the B-17 was the only operational heavy bomber in the American arsenal. There were only 30 of them in existence. The government pivoted. They gave Boeing unlimited funding. The order was clear: ramp up production immediately. Engineers added gun turrets. They reinforced the frame. They prepared for a war that was no longer avoidable. 20 of these early models went to Great Britain. The Royal Air Force needed them for high-altitude strikes. Disaster followed. One plane suffered a total power failure during the ferry flight and slammed into the ground. It was an omen. Things got worse when the planes reached the front lines. A small group of British B-17s flew toward a shipbuilding center in Wilhelmshaven, Germany. It was their first combat mission. The mission failed at 30,000 feet. The extreme cold froze the grease in the machine guns. The weapons jammed. Bomb sights failed in the thin air. The bombs missed the docks by miles. Then the Luftwaffe arrived. These early B-17s had a fatal flaw. They had no tail gunners. German pilots simply sat behind the bombers and opened fire. Most of the defensive guns were light .30 caliber weapons. They were useless against armored fighters. The Luftwaffe pilots were the most experienced in the world. They tore the formation apart. The early B-17s had no armor plating around the engines or the crew compartments. High-altitude flak exploded. Metal fragments ripped through the thin aluminum fuselage. Oil lines snapped. Fuel tanks ignited. Shrapnel shredded the crews inside their flight suits. The first missions were a massacre. Inexperience met bad tactics. Design flaws met seasoned killers. The Allies were learning how to fight a daylight air war through trial and error. The cost was paid in human lives. Every mission ended with empty hangars. The failure was so complete that the British made a drastic decision. They pulled the B-17 from European service entirely. The Flying Fortress was grounded. December 7, 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor caught the American fleet by surprise. 12 B-17 bombers sat on the tarmac. They never took off. All 12 were destroyed on the ground by strafing fire and explosions. The surviving B-17s in the Pacific moved quickly. They flew long-range reconnaissance missions over the ocean. Soon, they went on the offensive. A Flying Fortress dropped the first American bombs on a Japanese naval convoy. The heavy munitions hit the water and the steel decks. This was the beginning of the air war. But the Pacific was only the warm-up. The true test of the B-17 lay in Europe. These missions became the most dangerous in the history of aviation. To win, the United States had to destroy German industry. They established the 8th Air Force on English soil. They joined the British Royal Air Force to launch a massive combined bombing campaign. The plan was simple: fly across the English Channel, enter occupied Europe, destroy everything the German war machine needed to survive. The targets were specific: oil refineries, U-boat pens, and aircraft factories. The smell of high-octane fuel and grease filled the hangars as the planes prepared for takeoff. The strategy then shifted. The military began terror bombing. This meant targeting entire towns and cities. The goal was to break the spirit of the German people. They wanted to force an unconditional surrender by making life on the ground impossible. But the Germans did not break. The British had already learned a hard lesson. Flying during the day was a death sentence. German flak and fighter planes were too effective. The RAF switched to night raids. They traded accuracy for the safety of the dark. They could no longer see their targets clearly, but they were harder to shoot down. The Americans refused to hide in the night. They stuck to daylight bombing. They believed in two things: tight formations and the .50 caliber machine gun. Each B-17 was bristling with barrels pointing in every direction. They also relied on the Norden bomb sight. The Norden bomb sight was a top-secret piece of technology. It was an analog computer designed to calculate wind, speed, and altitude. During the final approach, the bombardier actually took control of the plane through an early version of autopilot. He looked through the glass and steered the entire bomber toward the target. But the technology had limits. In the early years of the war, 80% of the bombs missed their marks. Heavy smoke, clouds, and pilot nerves ruined the math. The theory of surgical strikes met the reality of physics. The Allies were now bombing around the clock. British planes by night and American planes by day. On paper, the Third Reich was under constant pressure. In reality, the cost was becoming unsustainable. The first daylight missions were a massacre. Losses were so high that commanders almost canceled the entire program. Metal was twisted and crews were lost in the clouds. Why did so many B-17 crews fail to return? It seemed the Flying Fortress was not as invincible as the name suggested. Events were reaching a breaking point. 77% of the crews were lost. It came down to 3 cold facts. 2 of these facts involved German defensive strategy. The first factor was the absence of long-range fighters. Initially, the plan was simple. B-17 bombers would fly without escorts. In 1943, small fighter planes lacked the fuel capacity for deep penetration. They could not reach the heart of Germany and return. The footage shows the moment of separation. Escort fighters reach their fuel limit. They waggle their wings and turn back toward England. The bombers continue alone. At that moment, they become targets. By the time long-range P-51s entered service, the damage was done. Thousands of airmen were already dead. The second factor was German adaptation. The Luftwaffe changed tactics. They didn't just fly, they hunted. Mechanics stripped the planes and installed heavy cannons. Pilots stopped individual dogfighting and moved to coordinated slashing runs. Why did they attack from the front? The bombers were most vulnerable there. German pilots began flying head-on at speeds of 400 miles per hour. Late in the war, the technology shifted again. The Germans deployed the first air-to-air rockets. Then came the Messerschmitt 262. It was the world's first operational jet fighter. It moved too fast for the bomber turrets to track. The third factor was the defensive fire of the B-17. Engineers added tail turrets and dorsal turrets. They packed the fuselage with M2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns. The tail gunner became the most dangerous man on the plane. The tail was a stable platform. It did not bounce like the side windows. The gunner didn't have to calculate complex angles. He simply fired straight back at the pursuing enemy. The sound of twin 50 calibers was constant. Because of this high rate of fire, the tail gunner carried the largest supply of ammunition in the entire aircraft. His position was a steel trap for any German pilot who stayed on his six. But even with thousands of rounds, the math was against them. The air war became a grinder. This was the reality of the daylight bombing campaign. 50% of the losses came from another source. Anti-aircraft artillery, or flak, was the primary threat. The standard 88mm cannon was the backbone of German defense. It fired a shell weighing between 9 and 10 kilograms. These projectiles moved at a high velocity. The ceiling was high enough to hit heavy bomber formations at peak altitude. Batteries did not fire at random. Gunners set time fuses to trigger bursts exactly where the bombers flew. One shell created hundreds of high-velocity steel fragments. These shards shredded the thin aluminum skin of the Boeing B-17. The metal sliced through fuel lines and severed hydraulic control runs. Inside the fuselage, the fragments hit the crew. The damage to the human body was catastrophic. Metal tore through flesh and bone instantly. The Germans relied on the Commando Garrett fire control system. This was an advanced analog computer. They paired it with 4-meter stereoscopic rangefinders. Later, they integrated Würzburg radar data to track targets through clouds. The computer processed range, speed, and altitude. It calculated elevation and azimuth in real time. Electrical cables sent these coordinates directly to the battery's guns. How did a battery operate? It functioned as a single machine. 4 or more guns fired in unison. They created a wall of timed bursts in the sky. But flak gunners faced a difficult task. The technology was primitive by modern standards. A shell required 20 to 30 seconds to reach the target altitude. This delay was a critical window for the pilots. Every 30 seconds, the bomber formations shifted. They changed course and altitude constantly. This ruined the gunners' calculations. Even a perfect volley could miss if the bombers flew unpredictably. The Germans responded with better radar integration. The Allies countered with electronic jamming and chaff. It was a technical duel. The footage shows the result: clouds of black smoke filling the air. Metal rained down on the formations. But during the final bomb run, the pilots had no choice. To aim accurately, the formation had to fly straight and level. They became sitting ducks. The evasive maneuvers stopped. This was the moment of maximum danger. The Germans shifted their tactics. They stopped aiming at individual planes. Instead, they used volume. They saturated entire blocks of airspace with explosives. If they fired enough shells, hits were guaranteed. Success became a matter of probability. The sky turned into a field of jagged iron. Inside the planes, the noise was deafening. The smell of cordite filled the cockpits. Men watched the black clouds erupt around them. There was no way to hide. They could only maintain their position and wait. Survival was a matter of luck. The crew members could do nothing but keep flying. 10 crew members operated the aircraft. 4 officers sat in the front: the pilot, the co-pilot, the navigator, and the bombardier. 6 enlisted men handled the rest. These men served as gunners, flight engineers, and radio operators. For defense, the B-17G model carried 13.50 caliber machine guns. They pointed forward, backward, up, and down. This was the definitive version of the bomber. It was a flying fortress. On the belly of the plane hung the ball turret. It was a cramped plexiglass sphere only 4 feet wide. Space was so limited that the gunner could not wear a parachute inside the ball. He left the chute on the floor of the fuselage above him. To exit during an emergency, the gunner had to rotate the turret manually. He had to align a small hatch with the opening in the aircraft's floor. Then, he needed a crewmate to pull him upward into the cabin. Only then could he strap on his parachute and jump. How long did this take? Seconds that the crew did not have. The plane was often already on fire or spinning toward the earth. Centrifugal force pinned the gunner against the glass. No one volunteered for this position. Enemy pilots also targeted the ball turret first. They knew it was the most dangerous weapon on the underside of the bomber. They aimed their cannons directly at the plexiglass bubble. The reality was brutal. One poet described the death of a ball turret gunner with 5 words: he was washed out with a hose. This was not a literary device, it was a physical fact. Ground crews witnessed the aftermath. 25,000 feet. At this altitude, the air is a void. The B-17 Flying Fortress lacked a pressurized cabin. If an oxygen mask failed, the crew had exactly 60 seconds before they lost consciousness. The environment was a sensory assault. Outside, the temperature dropped to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, crews wore heavy electrically heated flight suits. These suits were unreliable. They either froze or scorched the skin. Touching bare metal with a naked hand was a mistake. The skin froze instantly to the fuselage and tore off upon contact. Frostbite was not an exception, it was a standard injury. The footage shows crewmen clutching portable oxygen bottles. These small cylinders were a last resort. They provided just enough air to survive a rapid descent to breathable altitudes. But what if the plane didn't descend? Bailing out was rarely a solution. The statistics are grim. Only 1 in 4 crewmen who jumped over enemy territory survived. Most were captured. Many others died before hitting the ground. The bomber had 4 main exits: the nose hatch, the bomb bay, the waist doors, and the tail. In a spinning aircraft, these became traps. Centrifugal force pinned men to the walls, fire blocked the walkways, damage jammed the hatches shut. The ball turret gunner was the most vulnerable. He had no room for a parachute inside his bubble. The tail gunner's chute hung on the fuselage wall behind him. If the plane began to spin or the tail section caught fire, reaching that parachute was impossible. In the frame, a bomber breaking apart in mid-air. Many men fell without parachutes. Some gear was shredded by flak. Other men simply couldn't reach their packs in time. There were those who chose to jump into the void without a chute. For them, a sudden impact was better than burning alive in the cockpit. The losses were massive. Certain periods became legendary for their brutality. February 1944. The crews called it Big Week. In just 7 days, the 8th Air Force lost 244 bombers. 33 escort fighters went down with them. The sound of sirens and anti-aircraft fire was constant. 2,600 men were lost in those 7 days. They were killed, wounded, or taken as prisoners of war. Was the price worth it? At first glance, total carnage, but in reality, a strategic victory. These raids broke the back of the Luftwaffe. They targeted German refineries and scorched the fuel supply. The impact was visible on the ground. German tank crews began blowing up their own panzers. They had no fuel to move them and no spare parts to fix them. The campaign worked. Historians estimate the bombing shortened the war by at least 1 year. But the cost was absolute. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died on the ground. Tens of thousands of airmen never returned to their bases. The mission was a success. The human toll was a catastrophe. 5,000 men. That is how many B-17 crew members died in training accidents within the United States before ever reaching the front lines. They never saw combat. They never dropped a single bomb. They died in practice. Why was training so lethal? The answer was the formation. Pilots claimed the most dangerous part of any mission was the assembly. It began on the runway. Ground crews launched bombers at 30-second intervals. One aircraft would be lifting off while the next was already at full throttle behind it. 18 planes had to find each other in the sky to form a massive V-shape. Later, this requirement doubled to 36 bombers. They performed these maneuvers in the thick fog and low ceilings of the English climate. Visibility was often zero. The footage shows the result. Young, inexperienced pilots struggled to maintain distance. In the clouds, wingtips clipped tails. Heavy bombers collided and fell like stones. It was a meat grinder before the war even started. But the formation was a necessity. Statistics from the post-war era confirm the danger. Half of all B-17s shot down were aircraft that had drifted away from the group. Safety lived in the pack. What caused a plane to fall out? Sometimes it was a lack of discipline under fire. More often, it was physics. Heavy flak bursts tore the air apart, engines failed, damaged bombers lost speed and lagged behind the group. Once a plane was alone, it was a target. German fighters circled the stragglers. The formation provided overlapping fields of fire, creating a wall of lead. But this protection had a high price. A single flak shell could explode in the center of a group. It could damage 3 planes at once. A crippled bomber might lose its hydraulics, veer wildly, and slice through the aircraft flying next to it. There was also the risk of friendly fire. During a chaotic intercept, hundreds of machine guns opened up simultaneously. The sound was deafening. Gunners tracked swarming fighters with frantic movements. Each B-17 had a safety switch. This mechanism was designed to stop the gun from firing if it pointed at its own fuselage. But it did not account for the other bombers flying feet away. In the heat of the dogfight, gunners fired straight across the path of their wingmen. Switches failed, mechanical parts broke, gunners accidentally riddled their own tail fins with bullets. At first glance, the formation looked like a disciplined machine, but in reality, it was a struggle against gravity and chaos. Control was an illusion. The mission ended when the wheels touched the ground. For many, that moment never came. March 6, 1944. This date marked the beginning of the daylight raids on Berlin. It was the most dangerous mission of the air war. Berlin served as the capital of the Nazi regime. Because of this, it was the most heavily defended city in the world. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns formed a ring around the city. Massive concrete flak towers rose from the ground. These structures were indestructible. 500-pound bombs struck them directly and left only scratches. The Luftwaffe committed every available resource to the defense. The first major raid was a bloodbath. 69 American bombers were shot down in 24 hours. This remains the highest one-day loss in the history of the 8th Air Force. The sky was filled with parachutes and burning metal. But the mission achieved its goal. The bombers destroyed 160 German fighters. Fire consumed large sectors of the city. The footage shows the desperation of the German defense. By 1945, the Luftwaffe was failing. They lacked fuel and experienced pilots. In response, they formed special ramming units. These pilots had one order. If they ran out of ammunition, they were to fly their planes directly into the B-17s. Was this a coordinated strategy? It was. It was a German version of the kamikaze. Pilots used their aircraft as guided missiles. Several of these mid-air collisions were recorded during the final months of the war. Germany was collapsing. Only desperation remained. The statistics of the Flying Fortress are massive. Throughout the conflict, B-17 crews fired over 90 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. They claimed more than 18,000 German aircraft destroyed. These bombers dropped approximately 500,000 tons of explosives on occupied Europe. This was 1/3 of the total Allied tonnage, but the cost was absolute. 250,000 men served as B-17 crew members. More than 46,000 were killed, wounded, or taken as prisoners of war. The metal was replaceable. The men were not. Few other jobs in history have carried such a price. The missions continued until the end.